1944. Falaise Pocket, Normandy, France. Dusk presses like wet cloth into the stone of the village. Artillery rolls far off, a low ocean under the sky. Lantern light bobs, mud smells of coal and blood. Colette's Red Cross armband is a pale circle against her soaked sleeve, the cloth rubbed thin where she keeps her hand. Footsteps crunch on broken tiles. 12 men stand against the cemetery wall, shoulders square, eyes hollow. A stretcher leans nearby, empty. Someone coughs. A small photograph is folded in a prisoner's fist. He's the enemy. He's a patient. Shoot her then. You won't. Colette steps forward, arm raised so the band shows. The barrel of a rifle finds its line, breath held, the night waiting for a single decision. Mercy where hate was expected. A nurse stands between a firing squad and 12 POWs, her Red Cross armband the only shield. Colette does not argue politics. She invokes a medical oath to treat the dying, even an enemy soldier. Arthur Bennett watches with a bandage roll clenched in both hands. The prisoner with the photograph holds it like a talisman. Lantern oil smells sharp. Morphine ampules wait on a tray. Shells ratchet the night. Choices will have costs. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. The village sacristy had become a makeshift aid station a few weeks into the Falaise Pocket. Colette Moreau ran it with a small team. Arthur Bennett was the new British doctor sent to support the line. Their job was basic and brutal. Stop bleeding, treat shock, and prepare the worst for evacuation to a rear field hospital. Supplies were thin, morphine ampules counted by the strip, bandage rolls worn to fray, only a handful of stretchers. The building sat under the threat of shelling and patrols. Nearby irregulars demanded swift punishment for any local deaths. Triage was the quick sorting of who needed care first and who would live without it. The Geneva Convention's few clear rules were spoken aloud when needed. Prisoners must be protected, and medical staff are not combatants. Colette and Arthur had both sworn the medical oath, to treat the wounded without regard to uniform. Oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. Each man was examined quickly and logged on a scrap of paper. Name when known, obvious wounds, who watched him. Colette moved like a machine tempered by fatigue. Fingers to a wrist, a palm to a brow, a strip of gauze handed without hesitation. Arthur checked pulses and shaded eyes with a hand that trembled from lack of sleep. Outside, villagers pressed at the door. Voices rose and fell between grief and demand. An irregular officer spat that mercy would invite more death. Colette kept her voice low and steady, counting stretchers and planning who would go first if the shells closed in. The arithmetic was brutal, and every choice left a mark. The first removal came at dusk, when a farmhouse roof groaned under a new impact and the team ran into the lane. Colette grabbed a corner of a blanket and pulled a man free from under splintered wood. He moaned, arms useless, boots half in mud. Arthur checked the wound and hissed, "Fracture, possible pelvic." A volunteer handed over a morphine ampule, and Colette held the man's hand steady as the drug went in. They lifted him onto a stretcher between two soldiers, the canvas sagging with weight and fear. A child leaned from a doorway and reached for the armband as if it were a flame. They moved fast because movement kept the shells guessing, because standing still meant being found. Colette whispered to the stretcher bearer about padding under the head, a practical instruction that smelled of countless nights like this. When they set the man down inside the sacristy, Colette smoothed the blanket over him and counted pulse and breath. Arthur marked the scrap of paper. She never paused to ask which side his uniform suggested. Her hands had to do the work of deciding. That habit of seeing the person first would cost her friends and spare some lives. Later, 2 prisoners were brought in with ragged clothes and hands bound. One walked with a hitch, his leg splinted crudely. The other dragged his shoulder, eyes turned inward. Colette moved between the incoming wounded and the waiting locals who watched with thin patience. An irregular barked close enough to taste anger. "He helped the mine team," the man said, voice raw. "They blew the bridge," another added. Arthur stepped in and examined the prisoners quickly, his napkin-torn gloves finishing the gestures. He spoke the facts loudly so there could be no misheard rumor. "One has a compound fracture, the other shows shrapnel near the chest, both in shock." He looked at Colette for confirmation. She nodded and signed a bandage. She gave the bound hands a small cloth to bite on and loosened a strap just enough to check circulation. The officer outside slammed his fist on the doorframe. Medical duty meant recording wounds and deciding who should go first on the limited stretchers. The list was cruelly practical, and the order they chose would be judged by more than medicine. Colette understood that every selection could be read as political. That night, the sacristy became a small theater of quiet miracles. A man with a deep arm wound woke, dizzy, and found a woman he did not know offering him tea. Matthias, one of the prisoners, kept his face lowered, but when Colette bandaged his hand, he murmured a broken thank you. She folded the dressing with the same careful fingers she used on a local child earlier. The gesture made a sergeant bristle in the corner. "You treat him like yours," the sergeant said flatly. "He's under our care," Arthur replied. Arthur drew up a splint on a stolen broom handle and joked once, too tired to keep the edge from his voice. "If he runs, I'll stitch him myself." The men around edged a fraction closer, curiosity cutting through suspicion. A simple stitch would have been a surgeon's work, but they did what they could. Colette checked the morphine inventory again, counting ampules like a miser. The small acts of care threaded into a tense geography of suspicion. Each time Colette touched a prisoner, old men outside muttered that mercy was weakness. The community's grief found a target in those who wore the other uniform. Colette felt the weight of every whisper. When the irregulars convened under the broken bell tower, they brought a list, names, accusations, a demand for prompt justice. They argued that the village needed punishment carried out where all could see. The local officer who had been listening to the townsfolk paced and spat out the names. He had a son missing, and the wound made his hands tremble, where a steady hand would have been easier to obey. "Public execution," he said, slashing the air with a finger. "They killed neighbors," another answered. Inside, Arthur and Colette arranged the stretchers in a row and talked fast about what they could document on the slips of paper. Colette tucked a small pencil behind her ear. Arthur's jaw tightened. He knew documentation might be the only thing that protected the prisoners later. He tried to make a list that would survive a shaky signature. The demands from outside tightened like a noose on conversation in the room. The pressure to hand over the prisoners was as real as the fear of shelling. Colette counted the stretchers, the men with broken ribs, the 2 who needed immediate evacuation. She thought of the Geneva rules spoken this morning. Prisoners are protected, and of her own oath, which she had learned on a different, calm day. The law was thin paper in a place that wanted louder answers. She stepped out to speak to the officer, the armband visible on her sleeve. He stared at it, and then at the men lined against the wall. His face was a map of anger and lost sleep. "Take them now," he said. "I can't," she answered. The officer's lips curled. He asked whether a woman and a doctor could decide for the safety of a whole village. Colette did not answer the insult. She motioned to Arthur and held the armband higher. The moment made it clearer. Her authority would not be accepted by everyone. Back in the sacristy, the night stretched thin. Colette sat by a lantern and patched a mattress that had been torn by haste. Matthias, the prisoner with the photograph, lay awake and asked for water in a voice that was not proud. He kept the photo folded in his palm like a secret prayer. Colette poured water into a tin cup and set it where he could reach. "Is she your daughter?" she asked, nodding to the photo. "Wife," he corrected, then looked away. The smallest facts landed heavy in the room. Arthur prepared a list of names for the rear post and wrote descriptions that would guard the men with ink and truth. Each record might be a shield if someone later wanted to claim they had been executed lawfully. It was a bureaucratic mercy, but a mercy nevertheless. Colette watched him write and felt for once a thread of hope that paper could mean protection. At dawn, a rumor spread that a local leader would press charges of treason against anyone who had aided the prisoners. Voices rose as people passed the sacristy, and someone spat where Colette had stood the night before. The sergeant who had watched her dress the arm wound glared and would not meet her eyes. "You sided with them," he muttered. "I sided with life," she said. The accusation of betrayal began to form there in the open air. Women in the market stopped their hands on loaves. A baker who had supplied rations glowered across the square. Colette felt the room turn colder. An invisible line had been drawn. She had counted on resistance, but not on the stairs that followed her down the lane. Still, there were moments of softness. A child offered her a crust of bread, and a priest set aside a candle to burn longer in the sacristy. Rumors and gratitude braided together into a complicated map around her. Each kindness was a small counterweight to the hostility, but hostility had reach and memory. Colette knew she would be spoken of differently now. She knew the cost was not only in arguments, but in a changing tally of who trusted her. A visiting officer came through midday to inspect the records. He looked at the slips of paper, then at the men who remained. His eyes lingered on Matthias's photograph when it slipped from the prisoner's jacket. He hesitated before handing it back. He asked Arthur about evacuation plans and whether any prisoners were fit to move. Arthur's answers were careful, measured. "If we move them, we risk more fire," Arthur said quietly. "If we leave them, the village will finish them." The officer shot back. The officer's question was less about logistics than about danger to his command. He feared the ire of the villagers and the chaos of a retreat. The decision would not be made on medical terms alone. Colette, listening, felt the line between duty and discipline blur. At dusk, another convoy formed, this time with orders from a higher command to relocate anyone under medical care to a rear holding area. The instruction was bureaucratic and absolute, but execution depended on local goodwill. Colette wrote names again, and Arthur signed in a hand that had learned to steady under pressure. The convoy loaded slowly. Some carried their wounds like a private weather, Others sat in silence. As they left, women watched from the church steps, and a boy waved a torn glove. Colette stepped back inside and folded the armband, smoothing the creases. The fabric smelled of lantern oil and sweat. She placed it on the table with the pencil and the paperwork, not as a decoration, but as a small, holy thing that had kept 12 men from a wall. She did not know then what the morning would bring, only that paper and bandages could only hold so much against a village that wanted answers. The oath kept her moving, and the cost of following it would be tallied in stares and in decisions yet to come. A child came in with a cut across his scalp, where a roof tile had hit him. Colette sat on a low stool in the lantern light and parted the hair with fingers that smelled of iodine and smoke. Arthur handed her a needle and thread, his hands steady for once as he passed the suture. The boy watched each movement like a prayer and then squeezed his eyes shut. "Will it hurt?" he whispered. "A little," Colette said, soft. "Then you can play." She stitched quickly, counting under her breath, thinking of how a neat line of thread could stop a bleed that might kill. Outside, an old woman peered through the shutters and spat a bitter word at the men on the stretchers. Colette finished, tied the knot, and smoothed the bandage. The child's face relaxed as if the pain had been expected and was now forgiven. Small acts like that kept people alive and made others furious. Mercy in a town that wanted justice looked like softness. She accepted the price in looks and cold meals. Later, Arthur intercepted a burly irregular leaning into the sacristy's doorway, his coat still smelling of wintry smoke. He held a scrap of paper with names and times. "Hand them over," the man said, voice like gravel. "You have no authority here," Arthur replied. Colette stepped to the door and raised her arm so the red cross showed. The irregular scoffed and leaned closer, the threat in his eyes tracing the line between law and vengeance. Colette felt the armband heavy and not enough. "You think that will stop me?" he asked. "It has to," she said. Words were thin shields. The Geneva rule that medical staff are not combatants floated unspoken, like a scrap of parchment in the wind. Colette stood steady. The armband and her body forced a decision out of others. Her stance bought time, and time would be what saved some and cost others. Matthias, who had kept his hands folded and his head down, finally answered in halting French one night when Arthur asked about his work before capture. He spoke of mine lines and of a bridge that had been sabotaged weeks earlier. His voice was small and even. "If I tell you where they are," Matthias said, "will you help me?" "We treat wounds, not barter for secrets," Arthur said. Matthias looked like a man balancing shame and survival. He pressed the photograph into his palm and turned it over as if to decide whether to show it. The prisoner's knowledge tempted offers. Commanders listened for advantage. Colette set a cup of warm broth near Matthias and did not ask for his help in return. Care could not be reduced to intelligence. Mercy stopped at lying or trading lives. She would not let the wounded become currency. When word came that a road out had been cut and a convoy would be delayed, panic threaded the sacristy. 2 men needed immediate transfer. A local driver with a shattered collarbone who had run supplies all month, and a prisoner with shrapnel who gasped when he tried to breathe. The stretchers were already counted. The jeep meant to go first now might not leave until dawn. "Leave him," one of the volunteers urged toward the driver. "No," Colette said, looking at the prisoner's chest. "We stay until we can move both." Arthur rubbed his forehead. The sound of artillery was closer now. The decision to hold both meant exposure, and exposure meant tempting the anger outside. Colette sat beside the prisoner, held his hand, and steadied his breathing, while Arthur tightened a bandage and checked for shock. They prepared for the worst and hoped the best. Choosing who left first was a medical call and also a moral test. She chose by what the body demanded, not by the uniform, and that choice would be spoken about in market squares. A woman in the crowd accused Colette by name as she passed the sacristy the next morning. The woman's son had been killed in the bombing of the mill. Her grief made her sharp. "You sided with them," she spat. "I saw a man who needed help," Colette answered. The woman spat again and walked away. Groups gathered. Accusations grew teeth. A priest tried to calm people, invoking forgiveness, but every invocation slid across rawness. Arthur defended the records and the decisions at a town meeting, his voice even but tired. "She saved lives," he said. "They are not ours to shelter," a local leader countered. The room split into quiet factions. Colette listened and felt each word as a tally against her. She had expected disapproval, but the coldness in some faces surprised her. The trust she had before was eroding like mortar under rain. Yet in the corners of the sacristy, there were small, stubborn acts of kindness. A baker who had glared earlier slipped bread through the window for the wounded. A seamstress bound a bundle of clean cloths and left them on the doorstep with no note. A child set a carved wooden toy beside a stretcher that had once held a soldier, and Matthias smiled at the gesture before closing his eyes. Those small mercies kept the night from turning entirely savage. They were quiet votes for humanity. Arthur found a way to annotate the records with details that might protect the prisoners, times, witnesses, and the names of the aid workers who had seen the wounds. He wrote with a careful hand, as if composing a document that could one day speak louder than a mob. "These will stand for them," he murmured to Colette. "They might," she said, hoping. Paper could be a thin shield, but words on a list sometimes lasted longer than a shout. One afternoon, a courier arrived with orders to move anyone under care to a rear holding area 2 villages away. The note was stamped with a higher command seal and read with a voice of thin relief. It promised safety but required coordination and fuel, neither of which were plentiful. "Load the weakest first," the courier said. "Agreed," Colette answered. They loaded slowly, each transfer a small choreography of care. A head turned gently, a pillow fluffed, bandages rechecked. Matthias was helped onto a stretcher with great care, and for a moment his eyes met Colette's and held a recognition that was neither grateful nor guilt-laden. When they set off, the convoy moved like a fragile promise. Locals watched from windows, some with anger, some with curiosity. At a ford, the water ran high and the truck stalled. Men jumped to push, and Colette waded in to steady a stretcher. Cold water licked at her boots, and the armband hung heavy and damp on her sleeve. The convoy limped on, but not unscathed. A wheel came off a jeep and they lost time. Supplies were used up faster than anticipated. Arthur burned a morphine ampule on a sprained ankle because the man could not walk otherwise. Each expenditure felt like a small theft from future need. They arrived at the rear holding area by dusk, exhausted and wary. Colette handed over the paperwork and watched a clerk glance down the list. The clerk's stamp went down with the sound of finality. For a moment, a weight lifted. "Signed," the clerk said, almost apologetic. "Thank you," Colette replied, and left the armband folded in her palm. Yet relief held only so long. The road back to the village threaded through fields where men watched and judged. Rumors traveled faster than convoys, that Colette had delayed justice, that she had protected murderers. Names were added to lists in the wrong hands. A neighbor refused to look at her when she came back. She returned to a changed sacristy. The candle where she had once rested the armband was moved. Someone had turned it away, as if the light it threw was suspect. Arthur caught her hand in the dark corridor and squeezed. "They signed," he said, "but the town will not forget." "I know," she answered. Later that week, someone set fire to a barn at the edge of town. The blaze lit the night, and the smoke carried rumor like embers. Men ran with buckets, and Colette worked among them, offering bandages and water to anyone with heat-stung eyes. The armband was dirty again, but it carried a new mark, a smear where soot had met cloth. She wiped it with her sleeve and did not hide it. In the ashes, a man found a burned photograph and handed it to Matthias when the prisoners passed through again from the holding area. Matthias unfolded it and saw the edges curled but the face still clear. He traced the image with a finger and then looked up at Colette. "Tell her I kept it," he said in rough French. "I will," Colette replied, and the promise was small but real. These small exchanges were the grain of what kept her tethered to the oath, not the law itself, but the human acts that law tried to protect. The gestures were private contracts of care. As the front shifted and rumors cooled, Colette noticed that fewer people spat when she passed. Some nodded, though stiffly, in the market. A woman who had once accused her left a dozen eggs on the sacristy step with a note that read, "Only, thank you." Colette folded the note into her notebook like a relic. But the memory of accusations did not fade. She learned to live with both the gratitude and the scorn. Each required a different kind of stamina. One kind fed the soul, the other hardened resolve. One night, Arthur and Colette stood outside the sacristy under a thin moon. He held out a pen and a slip of paper that he had signed for the men who had been moved. The list had names and times and a small notation. Under care of medical staff. It was official and small. "You did right," Arthur said simply. "We did what we could," Colette replied. Her armband lay in her pocket like a coin she kept for luck. She had seen hatred and kindness hold each other in balance. She had learned that mercy could be loud in action and quiet in consequence. The oath kept her hands moving through the night, and the cost of those hands would be counted later in more than words. A patrol returned, faces hard with orders to finish what had been delayed. Men pushed forward, rifles rose like a single iron breath. Colette stepped between the line and the prisoners, the Red Cross clear on her sleeve, and unfolded herself against the barrels. "Step aside," an officer barked. "I won't," she said. "Then shoot." "You'll shoot a woman first." She rolled up her sleeve and offered her arm to the nearest prisoner for a blood match, voice steady. "Today, he is a patient. My oath is to that first." Colette folded the armband into her pocket. The cloth was still dark where soot and sweat had met. An empty morphine ampule sat on the tray beside the signed slip that listed 12 names. Some villagers nodded in thanks later, others kept their distance. The photograph stayed folded in Matthias's hand for years. Strength is restraint, civilization is a choice, If this account moved you, subscribe to the channel and explore more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.